Update on Sports Central, we go over our 2022 college football predictions for the Missouri Tigers, team that went 6-7 overall in the 2021 season. All this team being 2022 and whether or not Missouri is going to be better in the 2022 season is what we'll be going over here today. We'll be analyzing this team and predict their schedule game by game in this video. Starting out with your team trends, Missouri 6-7 last season. They were 3-3 in their first 6 games, 3-4 in their last 7. So it wasn't a bad season for this team. Definitely wasn't, outstanding by any means, but they did get up to 6 wins. They got to a bowl game and ended up losing that bowl game, the Armed Forces Bowl, to Army there, 22-24. But in the end, getting up to 6 wins is something that a lot of teams didn't do last season. But this team, they were a bit inconsistent last year. They took a couple of close, tough losses as well. They lost to Kentucky there. It turns out the Wildcats were a very good football team last season, and they lost to them by a touchdown, lost to Boston College on the road in overtime. So this team was very close to being an undefeated 4-0 heading into October, but then they had that terrible game against Tennessee. They took a loss there, and they were at home in that game. They took the loss 62-24. So certainly that was a brutal loss, and definitely kind of shows the inconsistency of this team at times. They beat North Texas the next week in a shootout. Then they lost to Texas A&M before their bye week by 3 touchdowns. They beat Vanderbilt coming off of the bye, and then they also lost to Georgia big. They beat South Carolina 31-28, beat Florida in overtime 24-23, so a couple of good wins there. Lost to Arkansas in their last game of the regular season, and then, of course, lost to Army in the Armed Forces Bowl, which they were a beatable team, I think, for Missouri. They could have definitely knocked off Army in that matchup, but in the end, just a close loss, and certainly didn't end the way that Missouri would have hoped, but 6-7 was the record for this team last season. Let's look forward to 2022. Now, your roster preview going into next season. This team does have several big changes. Of course, the starting quarterback, Connor Bazelak, he is transferred out. He is headed to Indiana, so he will not be on this team next season. Of course, he's been around for a couple of seasons. He played in 2020, was the primary starting quarterback in 2020, and also in 2021. And honestly, his stats weren't all that impressive. They were slightly better, maybe you could say, in 2021 versus 2020, but either way, nothing too outstanding. He put up 2,500 yards, as well as 16 touchdowns, 11 picks, and a 65% completion rate, so nothing too outstanding, that's for sure. And obviously, he's not a dual-threat quarterback. He doesn't rush at all, so, the passing stats then hold a heavier weight, and obviously his passing stats were not that outstanding. So Bazelak is gone, and I think that honestly might be for the better for Missouri going into next season. Just to move on from him and see if Brady Cook can be a better quarterback, which I see potential in Brady Cook. I do think he's a quarterback that could have a bright future for Mizzou. He put up over 300 yards last year, 2 touchdowns, no picks, and even a 79% completion rate when he played last season. Of course, he only passed 58 times, but we'll see how he does going into the season. It looks like he's going to be the favorite to be the starting quarterback, but there's also Jack Abraham, the Mississippi State transfer quarterback, coming in, which, there's a chance he'll maybe get a few snaps, but I think Brady Cook looks like he's going to be the main guy for now. Tyler Beatty, the top running back on this team, is gone. That is a very significant loss there, and that is, I'd say, the most concerning loss for me looking at this team going to next season. Tyler Beatty put up nearly 2,000 yards of offense last year and 18 total touchdowns between rushing and receiving. So he was an outstanding running back last season and really, had a major impact on this team. He had a huge influence on this offense last year. And he is not going to be an easy guy to replace, especially in a backfield that is pretty sparse going into this upcoming season. There's not much depth. You got Elijah Young coming back, who put up 200 yards last season, but that doesn't really compare to Tyler Beatty's 2,000. And you also got Pete coming in, a transfer running back from Stanford, but he really didn't have too big of an impact for Stanford last season. So the backfield is definitely one of my main concerns going into this upcoming season for Mizzou. Receiving core, you do return your top receiver there in Towski Dove, but you do lose your second in Chisholm. You return your third in Bannister, and then you lose your fourth, Hester, who is transferring out. So the receiving core, I'm not too concerned. There's a decent amount of depth. You return your top and your third, even though you lose your second and fourth. But there's multiple other receivers who did play a bit last season that are also returning. So not too concerned about the receiving core there. I mean, if you look at stats, no one really was a big standout. I mean, Dove last season, or Dove, put up nearly 600 yards. I mean, Chisholm put up over 503 touchdowns. So no one really had a major impact. They had a ton of receivers, though, who played a decent amount last season. You lose 2 on the offensive line, 3 defensive linemen. The defensive line could be an issue. 1 linebacker and 2 in the secondary. So defensively, you lose 6 of your starters there, 2 of your high-impact players in the secondary as well. So I'm a bit concerned about the defense as well. And so, I mean, returning production-wise, it's definitely not great for Missouri. And there's multiple question marks, but I will say the recruiting in the transfer portal is to Missouri's benefit going into the 2022 season. We'll go into that in a second. But how high is the ceiling for the Tigers going into 2022? I'd say, I mean, this team maybe 6 to 8 wins. They got a tough schedule. And of course, you're in the SEC. You're always going to have a tough schedule. But certainly for Missouri, it's going to be a challenging season, potentially kind of a rebuild season with the multiple significant changes that this team is going through. But I would say this team, they've got potential to be good. It's just a matter of how Brady Cook or the quarterback situation, whoever starts there, steps up, and also the backfield and the defensive secondary. But that's also your transfer portal and recruiting going into next season. You got Stacy Brown, safety in the transfer portal. He hasn't had a destination announced yet, but he is in the transfer portal. And then you got Josh Landry coming in, defensive lineman from Baylor. You lose Jamin Hester, receiver, to Oklahoma. Tyler Stevens, tight end, is coming in from Buffalo. Tyron Hopper, a linebacker, coming in from Florida. Of course, Jack Abraham, mentioned him before. He's coming in from Mississippi State. Quarterback Ian Matthews, defensive lineman, is coming in from Auburn. And you lose Wingo, defensive lineman, to LSU. So you lose a key player there in Wingo. That's definitely not ideal going into next season. Another big player on your defensive line. But you do bring in a few key players here. You got Pete coming in, running back from Stanford. Once again, mentioned him. He put up like 400 yards for the Cardinal last season. And so he hasn't had a major impact on a team yet, but we'll see. He needs to step up going into 2022 here for the Tigers. Sean Robinson, you lose him to K-State. You bring in Polgar, offensive guard from Buffalo. Bazelak, quarterback, he's off to Indiana. Tyrone Hopper, he's going to have an immediate impact, I can guarantee you. Linebacker from North Carolina. Jernigan could have an impact, defensive lineman from Oklahoma State. You also bring in Norwood, defensive back from Texas A&M. And you lose Hansford, edge rusher, to South Florida. Recruiting-wise, it's been excellent for this team. 15th in the nation, 6th in the SEC. You got 1 5-star and 8 4-stars coming in as well. So on the bright side, recruiting has been very good for this team going into 2022. So you got multiple players who could have an immediate impact on this team. Plus, of course, the transfer portal, you got a few key players coming in. You do lose a couple of your key ones, but ultimately you do bring in, of course, Hopper. He's going to be a guy to keep an eye on, linebacker from North Carolina. Mentioned Jernigan, potentially Norwood as well. So a lot of guys to keep an eye on going into next season. But that's also your schedule. Now going into 2022, you got Louisiana Tech in week 1, K-State in week 2. The Louisiana Tech game is on a Thursday as well. And then Abilene Christian in week 3, Auburn on the road to finish out your September. In October, you got Georgia, Florida, Vanderbilt, and South Carolina. And then in November, you got Kentucky, Tennessee, New Mexico State, and Arkansas. So that's it. Look at your September here. Louisiana Tech, I do say you beat them there, but in a closer one than expected. That's a game that you should, I'd say, win by probably 10 points. I could kind of see that being like a 27-17 type of win. But in the end, I will put that game in yellow because it's under 2 touchdowns. But you beat them. You lose to K-State on the road. That's a game that I really think is very winnable for Missouri. Going on the road there to K-State. But I think K-State next season could be in that 8 or 9 win range. So I do expect K-State to be pretty good. And going on the road there, I think K-State pulls that one out in a game that once again is winnable for Missouri, but it's not going to happen. Abilene Christian, easy win. And then Auburn on the road. I think you lose to Auburn, even though that's also kind of similar to K-State. A very winnable matchup. So you're 2-2 heading into October, which October is a pretty challenging month. Georgia, Florida to start off the month. Georgia, you lose to them. Florida on the road. I think you could beat Florida for sure. I mean, it's just another difficult road matchup, and I think Florida does beat you in a pretty close game. But I'm fairly confident that Georgia's going to beat you there on October 1st. Vanderbilt, you beat them by a couple of touchdowns, 2 or 3 touchdowns, I think. Vanderbilt, I just don't expect really nothing out of them going into next season. They're just a mess of a football team right now. And then you got South Carolina on the road. I think that's, once again, another winnable road matchup. But I think South Carolina pulls that out in a close one. So I'm predicting a lot of close road losses for Missouri going into next season, just because I'm going on the road into tough locations. I just don't know if Missouri is good enough to pull out some of those tough wins. So you're in 3-5 heading into November. November is also a challenging month besides New Mexico State. I think you beat Kentucky, though. I will give you that Kentucky one. I think that's it's another winnable matchup. Even though Kentucky is certainly going to be a good team once again next season, I could see them 8 to 10 wins. And I've got you beating Kentucky there, which would be a pretty nice upset win there to start off your November. Then you got Tennessee on the road. I think you lose to them, and then you beat New Mexico State by 2 or 3 touchdowns, maybe even more than that there on November 19th. And then you lose to Arkansas to finish out your season. So I've got you 5-7 next year, barely missing out on getting up to 6 wins, but it's just a challenging schedule playing some of those teams on the road, and I feel like this team suffers a lot of close losses, which keep them from making it to a bowl in the end. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below on Missouri, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.